On my son's first day at his father-in-law's corporation, I stood frozen, seeing him on his knees, scrubbing industrial chemical tanks. Amidst the crowd, the powerful father-in-law shouted insults. "That's the only thing this idiot is good for." I didn't say a word or show any anger. I just quietly walked out and made a single phone call. That arrogant man had no idea that at that very moment, his entire empire had already begun to crumble. I'm so grateful to have you here. To help us connect, please comment below with the city or country you're watching from. Also keep in mind this story features fictional elements for entertainment and education. Any resemblance to actual people or settings is coincidental, but the message I'm sharing is highly valuable for you. There are two kinds of power in this world, the kind that makes noise and the kind that waits. I've always been the second kind. My name is Arthur Callahan, and in the morning everything began to move. I was doing what I did every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday for the past 11 years. I was sitting behind a folding table at Maxwell Street Market on South Halsted, surrounded by broken clocks, dented radio sets, and a box of mismatched car parts that nobody ever bought, but everybody always touched. The city was still half asleep. It was the third week of October, and Chicago had decided to remind everyone that summer was finished. The temperature had dropped to 48 degrees overnight. My breath came out in small clouds above my coffee cup. The elm trees along the sidewalk had gone deep red, and the wind off the lake pushed the fallen leaves in slow circles around the legs of the folding tables. I like this time of morning, before the crowds arrived, before the noise, just the vendors setting up, the smell of coffee from Rose's cart on the corner, and the low murmur of men who had known each other long enough that they did not need to fill the silence. There was something honest about it, the particular honesty of people who have no performance left in them at 6 in the morning, who simply exist in the cold and drink their coffee and let the day arrive without ceremony. There were 4 of us old-timers who always sat up near the north entrance. People called us the chess players because 2 of us kept a board between our tables and moved pieces back and forth throughout the day. Nobody ever finished a game. That was not really the point. The point was the thinking. The patient, unhurried thinking of men who had lived long enough to understand that most of what passes for urgency in the world is simply noise wearing a watch. To anyone watching, we were 4 retired men with too much time and not enough sense to stay home where it was warm. That was fine. I had worked a long time to look exactly like that. I wore the same jacket I always wore. Canvas khaki colored, the kind of heavy-duty workwear that certain hardware stores sold 3 for $30. The left cuff was fraying. The right pocket had a small grease stain that I had never attempted to remove. My hands matched the jacket. Rough palms, thick knuckles, the permanent darkness under my fingernails that came from years of handling old metal. I had the hands of a man who fixed things for a living, and the posture of a man who had never expected anyone else to fix anything for him. I had cultivated this appearance the way other men cultivated reputations, carefully, deliberately, over a very long time. It had cost me nothing and protected me from things whose value I could not easily calculate. The GMC Savannah was parked half a block away. 1995 white, now more of an off-gray from age and road salt. The rear door was secured with a length of nylon rope, because the original latch had broken 2 winters ago, and I had never gotten around to replacing it. There was a dent above the passenger wheel well from a loading dock incident that I thought about more than I should. The truck suited the jacket, the way the jacket suited the table, each one an honest part of a picture I had spent decades making legible. My phone was face down on the table next to the coffee. One of the chess players, a man named Don, who had spent 30 years as a city assessor before he retired, looked up from the board and squinted at the sky. Don had the particular economy of a man who had spent 3 decades measuring things. He did not waste words any more than he wasted moves. "Front coming in," he said. "Tonight," I said. "You always say tonight." I am usually right. He moved a bishop and went back to his coffee. We did not speak again for several minutes. That was the kind of friendship we had, the kind that did not require maintenance, the kind that had been tested enough times by enough seasons that it no longer needed to prove itself through conversation. I was sorting through a cardboard box of wristwatches, checking which ones had salvageable movements when the phone screen lit up. Not a call. A text message from a number I did not recognize. No name, no area code I knew. I turned the phone over and looked at it. The message contained one thing, a photograph. I opened it. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. The image was dim, shot from a distance, slightly out of focus, the way phone cameras were when someone was trying not to be seen taking a picture. But the details were clear enough once my eyes had time to settle and assemble what they were receiving. A room below ground, concrete walls streaked with moisture, the kind of damp that comes not from a single leak, but from years of inadequate ventilation in a space that was never designed for long occupation. Fluorescent lights mounted in wire cages along the ceiling, throwing flat, merciless light across everything beneath them. And a man in an orange protective suit kneeling on the floor beside a large containment tank, scrubbing at the concrete with both hands in the methodical, unhurried way of someone who has decided that if the work has to be done, it will be done correctly. The man's face was turned partly away from the camera, but I knew the set of those shoulders. I had watched those shoulders carry a backpack through 12 years of school, hunch forward over textbooks. At 2 in the morning, straighten with quiet pride the first time he wore a suit that fit him properly. I knew the way he held his head, slightly forward when he was focused on something, that particular forward tilt that his mother used to say he got from me, though I never saw it in myself. Vincent had been at Sterling Biotech for 11 days. I set the phone down on the table. Face up this time. Don moved a rook, did not look at me. The sound of the piece on the board was very small and very precise in the cold morning air. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold. I drank it anyway, the whole cup slowly, the way you do something deliberate when you need your hands to have a task, so that the rest of you can work without interruption. There are moments in a man's life when something that has been slow and quiet and patient inside him stops being patient. I had felt this before. Once 23 years ago when the hospital called about Sandra. Once the morning I signed the papers that started Meridian. Each time the feeling was the same, not rage, not panic, but a deep tectonic shifting. The way the ground moves before anyone on the surface understands that it has moved. And now, on a cold Tuesday in October, sitting behind a table full of things that no longer worked, looking at a photograph I would spend the rest of my life wishing I had never received, I felt it again. I did not make a sound. I did not move. I just sat there for a moment and let the thing settle into me the way cold settles into old buildings. Not through the windows, not through the doors, but through the walls themselves, all the way down, through every floor, into the foundation. Then I put the phone in my pocket, stood up and told Don I would be back before noon. He did not ask where I was going. He never did. That was the kind of man Don was. He understood that some things a person carries alone not because they want to, but because the carrying is part of what makes them capable of arriving at the other side of it with something still intact. I walked to the GMC. I got in. I sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel and the engine off, looking at nothing in particular through the salt-fogged windshield. Then I started the engine and I drove. To understand what I did next, you need to understand what it cost me to raise him. Sandra died on a February morning when Vincent was 7 years old. Pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to the end, it took 4 months and 11 days. I know the exact number because I counted every single one of them, lying awake in the hospital chair, beside her bed, holding her hand and bargaining with a God I was not sure was listening. The morning she passed, Vincent was in the waiting room down the hall. A nurse had given him a juice box and a coloring book. When I walked out to get him, he looked up at my face and his lower lip started trembling immediately. He did not need me to say a word. He just knew. "Daddy," he whispered. My chest cracked open like old wood in a freeze. "Come here, buddy," I managed to say, and then I could not say anything else because my throat had closed entirely. I pulled him into my arms and held him there in that fluorescent hallway and felt his small shoulders shaking against my chest, and I made him a promise I had no business making. "I've got you," I told him, my voice breaking on every syllable. "I've got you. I've always got you." I meant every word. I just did not yet understand what it would require. The years that followed were the kind that either build a man or break him. I chose to be built. I worked construction during the day and drove for a car service 3 nights a week. On weekends, I sourced and resold salvage materials, broken appliances, old furniture, anything with parts worth saving. Vincent came with me, sometimes riding in the passenger seat of whatever truck I was using, at the time eating a sandwich his aunt had packed, asking questions about everything he saw. Dad, why do people throw away stuff that still works? Because they stopped seeing the value in it. That's dumb. Yes, I agreed. It is. He was 9 years old when he said that. He was already smarter than most adults I knew. What Vincent never saw, what I made absolutely certain he never saw, was the other work, the quiet work, the work I did late at night on a second-hand laptop at the kitchen table, after he was asleep, building a network of property investments through limited liability companies with names that meant nothing to anyone who did not know where to look. I had started small, a foreclosed 2-flat in Bridgeport, a vacant lot near the rail yards, things other people overlooked because they had stopped seeing the value in them. I wanted Vincent to know what it meant to earn something. I wanted him to understand the weight of a dollar before he ever held real money. That required him to believe we were exactly what we appeared to be, a father and son making their way on the South Side, no safety net, no shortcuts. So that is what I showed him. He graduated from Georgetown with a master's degree in finance at 26, top of his program. I drove to Washington in the GMC and sat in the third row of folding chairs with a paper program I kept creasing in my hands because I did not know what to do with them. When they called his name, I pressed my fist against my mouth because I could feel the tears coming, and I did not want to sob openly in front of strangers. I sobbed anyway, loudly enough that the woman next to me patted my arm. "Is that your son?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," I said, wiping my face with the back of my hand. "That's my boy." The night before his first job interview, Vincent came into the kitchen where I was eating cereal for dinner, my usual meal when I could not be bothered to cook, and told me he had nothing appropriate to wear. "I have a blazer," he said, holding it up. The lining was coming apart at one seam, and the collar had a permanent crease from too many foldings. "But it's not really a suit. I think I need a suit, Dad." "I'll handle it," I said. "Dad, you don't have to." I said, "I'll handle it." He looked at me with those eyes he got from his mother, dark, direct, and entirely too perceptive for my comfort. "Okay," he said quietly. "Thank you." What I did not tell him was that I had already arranged a one-day labor job for the following morning. A friend of a friend needed extra hands unloading a shipping container at a warehouse in Cicero. The pay was $240 cash. A decent suit from a department store sale rack ran about $220. The work was harder than I expected. By mid-morning, my lower back was screaming, and I had taken a bad step off a loading dock that sent pain shooting up through my left knee and into my hip. I finished the job because that was what you did. You finished the job. That evening, I came home with a suit in a garment bag and hands that were cracked across every knuckle. The skin split in 3 places, dried blood mixed with the grime of a long day's work. Vincent was at the kitchen table studying when I walked in. He looked up. His eyes dropped to my hands. I watched his face change, the brightness going out of it, something older and heavier moving in behind his eyes. His jaw tightened. For a moment, I thought he was going to cry. Instead, he stood up, crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, and wrapped both arms around me. He held on longer than he ever had before. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were red at the corners, glassy and full. "Dad," he said, his voice rough and unsteady. "Dad, don't," I said. I squeezed his shoulder once, firm and sure. "You're going to walk into that interview tomorrow, and you're going to show them exactly who you are. That's all I need." He nodded, pressing his lips together hard, visibly fighting to keep himself composed. "Okay," he said at last. "Okay, Dad." He put on the suit the next morning and stood in front of the bathroom mirror and straightened the lapels and looked, for the first time, exactly like the man I had always known he would become. He did not know that suit cost me 3 cracked knuckles, a twisted knee, and 2 weeks of pain I took in complete and total stride. He did not need to know. That was the whole point. The first time Richard Sterling shook my hand, he squeezed too hard. Men who do that are always afraid of something. Vincent had been seeing Elena for 4 months before he brought her to the market to meet me. I remember the morning, clearly a Saturday in late spring, the kind of Chicago day that almost makes you forgive the winter. He came around the corner of my stall with this young woman beside him, and even from 20 feet away, I could see the nervous energy rolling off him in waves. His shoulders were up near his ears. He kept glancing at her sideways, checking her expression, the way a man does when he is hoping desperately that two important things will like each other. Elena Reyes Sterling looked around the market with genuine curiosity, not the polite performance of someone tolerating an environment beneath them. She picked up a broken pocket watch from my table, turned it over in her hands, and asked me how the movement worked. I liked her immediately. She's the one, I told Vincent later when she had walked to Rose's cart to get coffee. His whole face lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. His eyes went wide and bright, and he broke into the biggest, most unguarded grin I had seen on him since he was 12 years old. "Yeah," he said, his voice cracking slightly with something between relief and joy. "Yeah," I said. "Don't blow it." He laughed so hard he nearly knocked over a box of radio parts. 3 months later, he called to tell me we had been invited to dinner with Elena's family. His voice on the phone had that particular tightness I recognized from his childhood, the sound he made before a difficult exam or when something important was about to be decided. "Her father wants to meet your dad," he said. "It's at Elena, downtown. I know where Elena is, Vincent." "Right, of course. It's just, he's a pretty formal guy. Her dad, Richard." A pause. "He's kind of a big deal in the biotech space." "Every man is a big deal in his own mind," I said. "I'll be there." Elena, on North Halsted, was the kind of restaurant where the menu arrived as a single laminated card, and the dishes came out looking like modern art installations. 3 Michelin stars, the kind of place where the sommelier knew your name before you sat down if you had a reservation worth knowing about. Richard Sterling had the corner table. He stood when we approached, and I took his measure in the few seconds before the handshake. 57 years old, broad through the shoulders, silver hair swept back from a face that had been handsome once, and now carried the particular hardness of a man who had spent decades being agreed with. His suit was midnight blue, custom-fitted, the kind of quality that announced itself without announcing itself. His cufflinks caught the candlelight. He smiled at me with every muscle of his face except his eyes. "Arthur," he said, extending his hand. "Richard Sterling. Vincent has told us a great deal about you." The grip was firm to the point of being a statement. I matched it exactly. Not harder. Exactly. "All good things, I hope," I said pleasantly. Something flickered across his expression, a microsecond of recalibration, like a man who had expected a different response. Then the smile resumed, smooth and practiced. Margaret Sterling rose beside him, cool and elegant in cream silk, offering me a handshake that barely qualified as one. Elena sat across from Vincent, and the moment the two of them looked at each other across the table, something warm moved through my chest. She reached over and touched his hand briefly, and he exhaled, like a man releasing a breath he had been holding all day. The dinner was exceptional. The conversation was careful. Richard asked about my work with the pleasant condescension of a man who's already decided what to think of you. "Vincent tells me you deal in antiques," he said, gesturing for the sommelier to refill his glass. "Salvage, mostly," I said. "Old machinery. Well, it's things that people have decided they don't need anymore." "Fascinating," he said in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. Margaret made a small sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a cough. Elena shot her mother a look sharp enough to cut glass. It was over the dessert course, a single perfect sphere of frozen chocolate that dissolved on the tongue, that Richard set down his spoon, straightened his jacket, and made his offer. "I'd like Vincent to come work for Sterling Biotech," he said. "I have a position in operations development. It would be an excellent opportunity for a young man with his credentials." Vincent's back straightened. His eyes went bright with excitement, and I felt a complicated surge of emotion move through me. Pride in him, pleasure at his enthusiasm, and something else underneath it all. Something cooler, something alert. "What would the role involve?" I asked. Richard smiled. "Learning the business from the ground up, the right way, no shortcuts." I looked at him for a long moment. He held my gaze with the easy confidence of a man who was never questioned. "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity," I said warmly. Then I excused myself to use the restroom. In the hallway, I took out my phone and typed a message to Julian Mercer. "Need everything you can find on Richard Sterling, and Sterling Biotech. Financials, legal history, corporate structure, all of it. Julian's response came back in under 2 minutes. How deep? I looked back toward the table. Through the gap in the partition, I could see Richard leaning forward, talking to Vincent with the expansive gestures of a man dispensing wisdom. Vincent was nodding, his jaw set with determination, his eyes full of the particular hunger of someone who wants very badly to prove himself worthy. My throat tightened so hard it almost hurt. All the way to the bottom, I typed back, "Start tonight." I put the phone away, straightened my jacket, and walked back to the table with a smile that cost me nothing and meant everything. The preliminary file Julian had been building since that dinner at Elena arrived on my phone at 6:47 in the morning, 3 days after I had asked him to start. Preliminary file attached. You'll want to read this before you eat breakfast. Trust me. I didn't eat breakfast. I sat at the kitchen table in my apartment in Pilsen, the same 3-room apartment I'd rented since Vincent was 9 years old, and I read every page Julian had compiled on Richard Sterling and Sterling Biotech. 41 pages. Some of it was public record. Most of it wasn't. By the time I finished, my coffee had gone cold, and my hands were resting flat on the table, perfectly still, the way they only go still when I'm working very hard not to react. I called Julian. "How solid is this?" I asked. "Solid enough that I triple-checked before I sent it," he said. "The debt structure alone is a disaster. 3.5 billion in outstanding obligations, and the company's been masking it with creative accounting for at least 2 years. 2 of their manufacturing plants were quietly sealed 14 months ago, OSHA violations. They never announced it. The employees in those facilities were reassigned or quietly let go. And the financials they filed publicly, partially fabricated. Their forensic accounting firm flagged anomalies 8 months ago. Richard fired them and hired a new firm the following week." Julian paused. "Arthur, this company is a house of cards. It's not a question of if it collapses, it's a question of when and how many people are standing inside when the walls come down." I thanked him, ended the call, and sat there for a long time. Vincent started at Sterling Biotech on a Monday. He called me that first evening, his voice carrying that particular energy he'd had as a boy on the first day of school. Bright, a little nervous, scrubbed clean of doubt, because he refused to let doubt take up space. "Dad, the facility is incredible," he said. "The research labs are state-of-the-art, and the executive team seemed sharp, at least in the meeting I sat in on. Richard gave a presentation on their Q3 projections, and the numbers looked strong." My jaw tightened. The numbers looked strong. Of course they did. Richard Sterling had spent 2 years making sure the numbers looked strong to everyone except the people who knew where to look. "How did he treat you?" I asked. "Professional. Formal. A beat. He called me the new hire twice during the meeting instead of using my name, but I figured that's just how he is with everyone at first. He called my son the new hire. I kept my voice easy. "Give it time. What's your role looking like?" "Junior operations analyst. It's entry level, but the exposure is real. I'll be touching procurement data, logistics chains, some of the vendor relationships. Richard said I'd rotate through departments for the first quarter." "Good," I said. "Keep your eyes open. Learn everything you can." What I did not say: I know what that company really looks like on the inside. I know what you're walking into. I said nothing because I needed Vincent to be exactly what he appeared to be, a young man, starting his career, earnest and ambitious, without any shadow of suspicion falling on him. The moment Richard Sterling sensed that Vincent was anything more than a green Georgetown graduate, grateful for the opportunity, everything would change. So I let my son be excited. I listened to him talk about the building, the cafeteria, the colleagues he'd met, a woman in legal named Claire, who'd been kind to him. And I kept reading Julian's file after we hung up. The text came on a Thursday, day 11 of Vincent's employment at Sterling Biotech. It was from a number I didn't recognize. No introduction, no context, just a photograph. It was the same photograph, the one I had already looked at a dozen times since it arrived. But seeing it now, after 41 pages of Julian's file, after everything I knew about what that building really was, the orange suit carried a different weight entirely. The details, I had memorized the set of his posture, the particular stillness of a person working carefully, because he had decided to do the job right, regardless of how he felt about it, no longer looked like a training exercise. They looked like a statement. It was the quiet grit of a boy forced into hard labor, yet working methodically because he refused to let them break his dignity. That was how I raised him. My throat closed. I called the unknown number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, a generic recording, no name. I hung up and stared at the photo again. Why is my son in a chemical storage room? Why is he in a hazmat suit? Why is someone photographing him without his knowledge? I called Julian. I just sent you a photo, I said the moment he picked up. Tell me what you see. 30 seconds of quiet. Then, that's a containment facility. The tanks in the background, those are rated for industrial solvent, storage, possibly pharmaceutical-grade chemical waste. Whoever is in that suit is doing manual labor in a restricted access area. Another pause. Arthur, is that Vincent? I think so. Why would a junior operations analyst be in a chemical containment room? That, I said, is exactly what I'm going to find out. I was already on my feet, already reaching for my jacket, the good one, not the khaki I wore to the market. My hands were not shaking. I'd made a decision long ago that my hands would not shake when it mattered. But my chest felt like something inside it had been grabbed and squeezed by a fist that did not intend to let go. I thought about the night Vincent was 7 years old when Sandra was still alive barely, and she'd held his face in both hands and said, "You're going to be the kind of man who makes the world better just by being in it. Promise me you'll always know your own worth." He'd promised her. I'd promised her. And now some man in an expensive suit had looked at my son who had spent 5 years earning a master's degree, who had memorized international trade law for fun, who had worn a second-hand blazer to his first interview because I couldn't yet afford a new one and decided that he belonged on his knees in a basement. I left the apartment without turning off the kitchen light. The game is officially changing. If you're ready to see how a man from a flea market starts dismantling a billion-dollar empire piece by piece, type "ready" in the comments, so I know you're still with me on this journey. And a quick heads up, the following chapters contain dramatized elements and fictional twists that may not be entirely factual. If you're looking for a dry documentary, you might want to turn off the video right here. I drove to Julian's office on West Monroe Street without calling ahead. He buzzed me the moment he saw my face on the lobby camera. 17 years of working together had taught him that when Arthur Callahan shows up unannounced, you don't make him wait in the lobby. His office smelled like printer ink and cold coffee. 3 monitors glowed on his desk, each one open to a different spreadsheet. Julian Mercer was 54 years old, thin as a wire with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on his forehead, and a mind that processed financial data the way other people processed oxygen, constantly, effortlessly, and without any visible sign of effort. He pulled up the photo I'd forwarded on his center screen and zoomed in. "The tank's in the back," he said, pointing with his pen. "See the yellow hazard labels? That's the NFPA 704 diamond, the fire diamond. Blue quadrant reads 3, red quadrant reads 2. That means the substance inside is a serious health hazard and moderately flammable." He set the pen down. "Arthur, whoever is cleaning in that room is not doing routine maintenance. That's active chemical storage." My voice came out quieter than I intended. "He has a master's degree in international finance from Georgetown." Julian looked at me over the top of his glasses. He didn't say anything because he didn't have to. We both understood what Richard Sterling had done. Taken my son's credentials, his years of sacrifice, his mother's dying wish, pressed into every page of every textbook he'd ever studied, and decided they were worth exactly nothing. Worth less than the orange suit on his back. I pulled up a chair. "Show me everything, all 41 pages. Walk me through it." Julian cracked his knuckles and began. Sterling Biotech had been Richard Sterling's inheritance, built by his father, James Sterling Sr., over 30 years in pharmaceutical-grade chemical manufacturing. At its peak, the company operated 7 plants across Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, employed just over 2,000 people, and held contracts with 4 of the top 10 hospital supply chains in the Midwest. Then Richard took over. "He didn't dismantle it overnight," Julian said, pulling up a timeline on his left monitor. "He was actually competent for the first 3 years, expanded 2 facilities, secured 2 new federal contracts, but then he got ambitious. He borrowed against the company's assets to fund a biotech R&D division, cutting-edge gene therapy research. High risk, high reward, and it failed. How badly? The R&D division burned through $900 million in 4 years and produced nothing commercially viable, not one product approved by the FDA. Julian switched to a financial summary. To cover the losses, Richard started borrowing more. By the time the debt reached $2 billion, he should have restructured. Instead, he borrowed more to make the existing payments look current. Robbing Peter to pay Paul, I said. Robbing Peter, James, and every other apostle in the building. The current debt sits at $3.5 billion. Interest obligations alone run approximately $14 million per month. Julian leaned back in his chair. And here is where it gets criminal, Arthur. The financial statements Sterling filed with the SCUCEC for the last 2 fiscal years, they've been manipulated. Revenue figures inflated by an estimated 30%. Liability disclosures incomplete. 2 sealed plants, the Hammond facility and the Joliet facility, are still listed as operational assets at full valuation. I stared at the screen. So he's filing fraudulent documents with federal regulators. That's the polite way to put it. Julian pulled up one final document, a scanned internal memo dated 8 months prior from Sterling Biotech's former forensic accounting firm. The language was careful, measured the way lawyers write when they're trying to be accurate without being incendiary. But the conclusion was clear, significant material misstatements. Recommend immediate disclosure, potential securities violations. Richard had fired them the following week. He's not just in debt, I said, slowly reading the memo again. He's one whistleblower away from federal indictment. Or one creditor from calling their loans. Julian folded his hands on the desk. The company is a castle built on sand, Arthur. It looks magnificent from the street, but underneath the foundation has been washing away for years. All it takes is one strong wave. I sat with that for a moment. 2,000 employees, real people with mortgages and children and grocery bills, who showed up every morning believing they were working for a functioning company. They didn't know their salaries were being funded by debt Richard Sterling had taken on in their company's name. They didn't know that 2 of their facilities had been sealed for safety violations their employer had never disclosed. They didn't know that the man at the top had been gambling with their livelihoods for years and losing. And Vincent was in the basement of that castle on his knees, in an orange hazmat suit, believing that if he worked hard enough and kept his head down and proved his value one day, Richard Sterling would look at him and say, "You belong here." My chest ached with a grief I hadn't felt since the night Sandra died. I stood up. "Julian," I said, "I want to own that company." He stared at me. "Not rate it, not short it, own it." I buttoned my jacket. "Find me the entry point. Find me whoever holds the most vulnerable position in his debt structure. Find me the thread that when I pull it, the whole thing comes apart in my hands and not anyone else's." Julian was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen. "Give me 72 hours, he said. I nodded and walked out into the corridor, already thinking 3 moves ahead. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on top of the covers in my apartment, still dressed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had been there since 2011, and that I'd never bothered to fix, because some part of me had always thought of this apartment as temporary, a place to pass through, a holding pattern between the life I'd lost when Sandra died and whatever came next. 15 years later, I was still here. The photograph was open on my phone, propped against the lamp on my nightstand. I kept looking at it the way you look at something that hurts, not because you enjoy the pain, but because you need to make sure the pain is real, that you aren't exaggerating, that what you think you're seeing is actually what is there. My son, in an orange hazmat suit, on his knees in a basement. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes until I saw white. The memory came the way memories always do, uninvited, precise, arriving with the particular cruelty of perfect clarity. Vincent was 8 years old. It was February, the kind of Chicago February that doesn't apologize for itself, and I had just come home from a double shift at the freight yard. My boots left wet salt prints across the kitchen linoleum. I was so tired my vision was doing something strange at the edges, going soft and gray like an old photograph. He was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, 3rd grade math. He'd lined up his pencils by size, the way Sandra used to line up her paintbrushes, and something about that small, unconscious inheritance made my throat tighten so sharply I had to stop in the doorway and breathe. He looked up and saw my face. "Dad," he said, You look really tired. I'm fine, buddy. You don't look fine. He pushed his chair back and went to the refrigerator with the solemn purpose of a child who has decided to solve a problem. He came back with a glass of orange juice, the kind from concentrate, the only kind we could afford, and set it on the table in front of me with both hands, carefully the way you set down something precious. Mom used to say orange juice fixes everything, he said. I sat down, I drank the orange juice, and then I put my arms on the table and I wept in front of my 8-year-old son silently and completely because I was exhausted and I missed Sandra, and I was terrified genuinely, bone-deep terrified that I was not going to be enough for him. He didn't tell me to stop. He didn't look frightened or embarrassed. He pulled his chair around next to mine and pressed his small shoulder against my arm and stayed there steady as a stone until I was finished. You're the best dad, he said when I finally lifted my head, even when you cry. I had carried that moment for 20 years. I carried it the way you carry something that has no weight and all the weight in the world simultaneously in your chest, just beneath the sternum, always present, never burdensome. I got up at 4 a.m. and went to the kitchen. I made coffee. I sat at the table where I'd read Julian's file, and I opened my notebook, a plain black composition book, the same kind I'd used for 30 years, to track property assessments, LLC formations, and investment timelines, and I started writing. At the top of the page, I wrote 2 words, Sterling Biotech. Beneath it, I wrote what I knew. The company was dying. Richard Sterling knew it and was hiding it. The SEC didn't know the full picture yet. The creditors were circling but hadn't moved. The debt was real, the fraud was real, and somewhere in that structure was a fulcrum, one point of leverage that if I placed my weight on it correctly, would tilt the entire edifice in my direction. Julian would find it. He always found it. What I needed to decide, what I sat with in the gray 4 o'clock silence of my kitchen, was what came after. Because this was not simply a business acquisition. I had acquired businesses before. I had purchased distressed properties and undervalued companies through Callahan Capital Partners for 2 decades, quietly, methodically, without fanfare or public record. I knew how to do this. I knew how to find the thread and pull it. But this was Vincent. This was my son who had pressed his small shoulder against my arm when I was broken and said, "You're the best dad, even when you cry." This was the boy I had raised on orange juice from concentrate and library books, and the absolute unshakable conviction that his worth was not negotiable, not by circumstance, not by poverty, and not by any man who happened to own a building he worked in. Richard Sterling had looked at my son and seen a body to fill an orange suit. I looked at my son and saw everything Sandra and I had poured into 28 years of living, every sacrifice, every double shift, every skipped meal, every night. I'd lain awake calculating how to stretch $1 far enough to cover his tuition without him ever knowing how close to the edge we were. I closed the notebook. I picked up my phone and sent Julian a message at 4:17 in the morning. Don't just find me the entry point. Find me everything. I want to own every room in that building, including the basement. The reply came back in 4 minutes. Already working on it. Get some sleep, Arthur. I almost smiled. I didn't sleep. But for the first time since I'd seen that photograph, the tightness in my chest loosened just slightly, just enough because the plan was no longer a question. It was a decision. And Arthur Callahan, once a decision was made, did not look back. Julian called me 71 hours later at 7:14 in the morning while I was at the market pretending to sell broken clocks. I found it, he said. I set down the pocket watch I'd been examining and turned slightly away from Don and the others. My voice dropped to the register I used when the conversation was not for anyone else. Talk to me. Meridian Capital Group, private equity firm based in New York, 53rd floor of 1 Vanderbilt. They hold $2.8 billion of Sterling's total debt, not spread across multiple creditors, concentrated. One entity. Julian paused for effect because Julian always paused for effect when the number was significant. They bought the debt 18 months ago from 3 separate banks that were desperate to get Sterling off their books, consolidated it. Which means if Meridian calls that debt, all of it simultaneously, Richard Sterling doesn't have 72 hours before the company is in federal bankruptcy court. I kept my face neutral. Don glanced over and I gave him a small nod, the universal gesture of just a phone call, nothing interesting. What's Meridian's position? I asked. Uncomfortable, They bought Sterling's debt at a discount, expecting to force a restructuring and flip the assets for a profit. But they underestimated how deeply compromised the company's books were. Now they're sitting on $2.8 billion in distressed debt, tied to a company that may be under SEC investigation within 6 months. Every week they wait, their exposure increases. Another pause. Arthur, they want out. They just don't have a clean exit. Until now, I said. Until now, Julian agreed. I left the market at noon and drove directly to my real office. Not the apartment in Pilsen. The office that existed in a different layer of my life, the layer that wore a different jacket. Callahan Capital Partners occupied a quiet floor in a building on South Michigan Avenue. No lobby signage, no listed phone number. The kind of address that appeared in corporate filings but never in newspapers, which was exactly how I had always preferred it. My assistant, Patricia, handed me a coffee and a printed summary of Meridian Capital Group's portfolio without being asked. She had been with me for 11 years and had developed the useful habit of anticipating what I needed before I could articulate it myself. Meridian's managing partner is a man named Gerard Voss, she said, following me into my office. 61, Yale MBA. He took over the firm 9 years ago, reputation for being aggressive on distressed debt acquisitions, less patient with long recovery timelines. He's been trying to exit the Sterling position for 4 months. Who does he use for legal counsel? Hartwell and Crane's Chicago office. She set a business card on my desk. Their lead restructuring attorney is Carol Finch. She drafted the original debt consolidation agreement for Meridian. I picked up the card. Get me a meeting with Carol Finch, not Voss Finch. Tell her it's a private consultation regarding a potential Sterling biotech transaction. This week, if possible. Patricia nodded and was gone before I'd finished the sentence. I sat down at my desk and opened Julian's full file for the third time. 41 pages. I had read them until I could recite the debt schedule from memory, until the names of Richard Sterling's shell companies felt as familiar as my own. There was a particular document on page 31 that I kept returning to, a covenant clause buried in the original debt agreement between Meridian Capital and Sterling Biotech. Standard language, the kind that gets copied from template to template without anyone paying close attention. Except this clause was not standard. This clause stated that in the event of a material misstatement in Sterling's financial disclosures, verified by an independent forensic audit, Meridian Capital had the right to demand immediate repayment in full, bypassing the standard 90-day cure period. Richard Sterling had signed it. His lawyers had either missed it or underestimated the probability of it ever being triggered. In either case, it was now the most important 37 words in a 41-page file. Because I had a forensic accounting team, the best in Chicago, retained by Callahan Capital Partners for exactly these situations, and I had Julian's preliminary findings, and I had the internal memo from the firm Richard had fired 8 months ago. The material misstatements existed. They were documented. And the moment an independent auditor verified them on the record, Meridian Capital's covenant clause activated like a pressure valve, and the entire Sterling Biotech debt structure would rupture from the inside. I didn't need to destroy Richard Sterling publicly. I didn't need to file complaints or make phone calls to regulators or do anything that could be traced back to a motivated buyer trying to force a sale. All I needed to do was present Carol Finch with the evidence that the covenant clause was about to trigger naturally, whether I was involved or not, and offer Meridian Capital a clean private exit before the collapse became a federal matter. They would sell me the debt. I would own $2.8 billion of Sterling Biotech's obligations. And then Richard Sterling would receive a phone call that would change every calculation he had ever made about who mattered and who didn't. I closed the file. My hands were steady. My coffee was getting cold. Through the window, Lake Michigan was flat and gray and enormous, stretching out to a horizon that looked from this height like the edge of the world. I thought about Vincent in his orange suit on his knees in the basement of a man who thought he owned the ground other people walked on. I thought about Sandra saying, "Promise me you'll always know your own worth." I picked up the phone and called Patricia. "Move the Finch meeting to tomorrow morning if she's available," I said, "and tell her to bring the Sterling Covenant documentation." A beat of quiet. "Already on her calendar," Patricia said. 8:30. She said she'd been expecting a call. I set the phone down slowly. She'd been expecting a call, which meant Gerard Voss and Carol Finch were more desperate than they had let on. Good. Desperate people make clean deals. The meeting with Carol Finch lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. She was exactly what I had expected. Sharp, composed, the kind of attorney who had spent 20 years in restructuring law and had developed the particular quality of stillness that comes from sitting across the table from desperate people and knowing always that she was the least desperate person in the room. Until that morning, I watched the stillness crack just slightly, just once, when I set Julian's forensic summary on the table between us. 41 pages, tabbed and indexed, with the covenant clause bookmarked in red. She didn't reach for it immediately. She looked at it the way you look at something you've been dreading with recognition. "Where did you obtain this?" she asked. "Independent forensic analysis of publicly available SEC filings and corporate disclosures," I said. "Everything in that file was obtained legally. Every page is documented and sourced." She picked it up then. She read for 6 minutes without speaking. When she set it down, the stillness had returned. But it was a different kind of stillness, the stillness of a person recalculating. "The covenant clause," she said, at page 31. I confirmed. Paragraph 4, subsection C. She looked at me directly. "Mr. Callahan, what exactly are you proposing?" "A clean exit for Meridian Capital," I said. "Before the clause triggers on its own, which based on this analysis is a matter of months, not years. I'll acquire Meridian's full sterling position at a negotiated discount. Meridian walks away from $2.8 billion in distressed exposure. No federal entanglement, no public disclosure, clean." Carol Finch was quiet for a moment. "And what do you intend to do with Sterling Biotech once you control the debt?" she asked. I met her eyes. "Restructure it, properly, the way it should have been done 2 years ago." She studied me for a long moment, then opened her portfolio and uncapped her pen. "I'll need 72 hours to consult with Gerard Voss," she said. "You have 48, I replied. "After that, I take my analysis directly to the SEC's Division of Enforcement and let the clause trigger naturally. Meridian can sort out their exposure without my help." The pen paused above the paper. 48 hours, she repeated. 48 hours? I confirmed. I was in the parking garage beneath the building, keys in hand, when my phone rang. "Vincent." I answered immediately. "Hey, buddy." "Dad?" His voice was wrong. Not frightened. Vincent didn't do frightened, not the way most people did. But there was something compressed in it, something held very tightly under pressure, the way a pipe sounds just before it gives. "What happened?" A breath. "Then I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." My chest tightened. "Always." "Did you—" He stopped, started again. "Did you know what this company was before I took the job? Did you know what Richard Sterling was?" The garage was cold and dim around me. Somewhere above, a car door slammed and echoed. I made a decision in the space of 2 seconds, the kind of decision that has no good options, only less damaging ones. "Why are you asking me that right now?" I said carefully. "Because today, Richard called me into his office," Vincent said, and now I could hear it clearly. The compression in his voice was anger, tightly managed, burning slow and even like a coal rather than a flame. He told me that my rotation schedule was being modified, that I'd be spending the next 4 weeks in the sub-level containment facility, doing what he called, and I'm quoting him directly, "Dad Foundational Operations Familiarization." I didn't say anything. I let him continue. "Foundational Operations Familiarization," he repeated, and the bitterness in those 3 words was so precise, it could have cut glass. I asked him what that meant specifically. He smiled. He actually smiled. And he said that every great operations analyst needs to understand the company from the ground up, literally, and that the sub-level containment team needed an extra body this month. "Vincent, I'm cleaning chemical storage tanks, Dad." His voice cracked on the last word just once, just a hairline fracture before he sealed it back up. "I have a master's degree from Georgetown. I passed the CFA Level 1 on my first attempt. I spent 5 years studying financial systems so I could understand how companies actually function at the highest level. And Richard Sterling looked at all of that and decided the most valuable place for me is in a basement in an orange suit scrubbing the inside of industrial tanks." My eyes were burning. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth for a moment. "Are you safe?" I asked. "Physically, is the environment safe? OSHA-compliant gear, Proper ventilation. I checked. Of course he checked. Of course my son, humiliated and furious, still checked the safety protocol before anything else. I'm not calling because I'm scared, Dad. I'm calling because I'm... Another fractured breath. I'm so angry I don't know what to do with it. And I don't want to do something that ruins everything I've worked for. So I needed to hear your voice. The burning behind my eyes became something I had to actively hold back. Then listen to my voice, I said. You go back tomorrow. You put on the suit. You do the work. You do it better than anyone else in that building has ever done any task they were given, because that's who you are, and you trust me. A long pause. Trust you to do what? He asked quietly. To make sure, I said, that this is the last time any man ever puts you on your knees. The silence on the line was not empty. It was full of 28 years of orange juice and library books and double shifts, and Sandra's voice saying, promise me you'll always know your own worth. Full of everything a father and a son carry between them that never gets said directly because it doesn't need to be. Okay, Dad, Vincent said finally. His voice was steadier now, solid. Okay, get some rest, I said. And Vincent, don't quit. Not yet. I won't. We hung up. I stood in the cold parking garage for a long time, my hand still wrapped around the phone. My jaw set, my eyes dry now, because I had sealed everything back up where it belonged. 48 hours. Carol Finch had 48 hours. And Richard Sterling had no idea that the thread had already been found and the pull had already begun. Gerard Voss called me personally at 6:43 the following evening. Not Carol Finch, Voss himself, which told me everything I needed to know about how the 48 hours had gone inside Meridian Capital's boardroom. Mr. Callahan, he said. His voice was the voice of a man who had spent 4 decades being the most powerful person in every room he entered, and was now sitting in a room where that was no longer true. It had a particular texture, smooth on the surface, fraying underneath. I understand you've made a proposal to our legal counsel regarding the Sterling position. I said. I was at my desk on South Michigan Avenue, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a cup of coffee going cold at my right hand. The lake was dark outside the window, the last of the evening light dissolving into gray. I'd like to discuss it directly, Voss said, man to man. I prefer that, I replied. What are your terms? A pause. The kind of pause that costs a proud man something to get through. We acquired Sterling's consolidated debt at 62 cents. On the dollar, he said. 2.8 billion face value. Our basis is approximately 1.7 billion. We need to recover our basis, plus a reasonable margin to justify the exit to our investors. Define reasonable, I said. 1.9 billion, he said. Cash or equivalent. Clean transfer, no contingencies, full indemnification from any future SEC action related to Sterling's disclosures. I picked up my pen and wrote the number down, even though I had already calculated it before he called. Mr. Voss, I said, I'll give you 1.75 billion, cash, closing within 30 days. In exchange, Meridian provides full cooperation with any independent audit I commission prior to closing, and full transfer of all covenant rights under the original debt agreement. Another pause, longer this time. The indemnification clause, he began, is not something I'll provide, I said. What Meridian did or didn't know about Sterling's disclosures when you acquired that debt is between you and the SEC. That's not my liability to absorb. The silence on the line stretched for nearly 10 seconds. 1.8, Voss said finally. That's my floor. I had expected this. I had budgeted for this. Callahan Capital Partners had spent 22 years building a position that could absorb a number like 1.8 billion without structural damage, quietly and visibly, through 3 decades of real estate acquisitions, LLC formations, and distressed asset purchases that had never made a single headline. 1.8, I agreed. 30-day close, full covenant transfer, independent audit cooperation. I'll have my attorneys send the term sheet by 9 tomorrow morning. Agreed, Voss said. Then after a beat, can I ask you something, Mr. Callahan? You can ask. Why Sterling Biotech, a company this distressed, this legally complicated? There are cleaner opportunities in this market. Why this one? I looked out at the dark lake for a moment. Because sometimes the right opportunity isn't the cleanest one, I said. Sometimes it's just the right one. He didn't press further. We ended the call. I sat at my desk for a long time after I hung up. $1.8 billion was not a casual expenditure, even for Callahan Capital Partners. It required moving assets, liquidating positions, restructuring internal credit lines, a significant choreography that Patricia and Julian would spend the next 30 days executing with surgical precision. But the money was not what I was thinking about. I was thinking about page 31, paragraph 4, subsection C, the covenant clause that now belonged to me. Because the moment the debt transfer closed, the moment Callahan Capital Partners became the primary creditor of Sterling Biotech, I would have the legal right to commission an independent forensic audit of Richard Sterling's financial disclosures. And when that audit confirmed what Julian's preliminary analysis had already documented, the inflated revenue, the concealed liabilities, the fabricated asset valuations, the covenant clause would activate. Immediate repayment in full. $3.5 billion. Due. Now, Richard Sterling did not have $3.5 billion. Richard Sterling did not have $3.5 million that wasn't already pledged against something else. His company was a mechanism for generating the appearance of solvency, and the moment that mechanism was examined by an auditor who couldn't be fired, the appearance would dissolve. He would have no choice but to negotiate, and I would be the only person at the table with anything to offer. I opened my desk drawer and took out a photograph, not the dim blurred image from the unknown number, but an older one. Vincent at his Georgetown graduation. Navy blue gown, mortarboard slightly crooked, because he'd never been able to keep hats straight. Grinning at the camera with his whole face the way he'd grinned as a boy, before the world had started teaching him to be careful with his joy. Sandra would have wept at that graduation. The good kind of weeping, the kind that comes when something you feared might never happen, finally undeniably does. She hadn't made it. Pancreatic cancer does not negotiate with graduation schedules. But I had been there. I had sat in the third row, in a suit that had taken me 4 months to save for. And I had watched my son cross that stage, and I had wept the way Sandra would have openly, completely without any embarrassment at all, because some moments are too large for dignity. I put the photograph back in the drawer. I picked up my phone and sent Julian a single message. Voss agreed. 1.8. Begin transfer preparation. His reply came in under a minute. On it. Arthur, we're actually doing this. I smiled. Not the almost smile from earlier in the week. A real one, quiet and private and entirely my own. We're doing this, I typed back. Tell Patricia to clear my calendar for the next 30 days. I closed the phone, finished the cold coffee in one long swallow, and began making a list of everything that needed to happen before Richard Sterling learned that the ground beneath his castle had already shifted, and that the man who had moved it had been sitting at a folding table selling broken clocks on Maxwell Street the entire time. The debt transfer closed on a Tuesday 27 days after Gerard, Voss, and I shook hands over the phone. Patricia handled the closing documents. Julian managed the asset liquidations. Carol Finch's team at Hartwell and Crane processed the covenant transfer with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that speed in transactions of this nature was its own form of discretion. By 4:17 in the afternoon, Callahan Capital Partners was the primary creditor of Sterling Biotech, holding $1.8 billion of acquired debt and every contractual right that came with it. I signed the final page in my office on South Michigan Avenue, set down the pen, and felt nothing dramatic. No surge of triumph, no electricity, just a deep, steady settling like a ship finding its draft after a long time listing in shallow water. Patricia brought me coffee without being asked. Congratulations, she said, which was the most expressive thing she had said in 11 years of working together. Thank you, Patricia, I said. Now, let's get to work. I commissioned the independent forensic audit the following morning. The firm was Alderman and Cross, 40 years in business offices in Chicago, New York, and Washington, D.C., with a client list that included 3 federal agencies and 2 major international banks. They were not the kind of firm you hired for routine compliance work. They were the kind of firm you hired when you needed the truth, documented in language that would survive a courtroom. Their lead partner, a woman named Dr. Sylvia Crane, no relation to the law firm, called me the afternoon after I retained them. Mr. Callahan, she said, We've done a preliminary review of the publicly available Sterling Biotech filings. Before we begin the formal engagement, I want to be transparent with you about what we're likely to find. Please, I said. The discrepancies in their last two annual reports are not subtle, she said. Her voice was precise and unhurried, the voice of a person who had delivered difficult findings to powerful people many times and had long since stopped being anxious about their reactions. Revenue appears to be inflated by somewhere between 28 and 34%. The two sealed facilities, Hammond and Juliet, are carried at full operational value on the balance sheet, despite being non-functional for over a year. And there are intercompany transfer patterns that suggest funds are being moved between Sterling Biotech and at least 3 subsidiary entities in ways that obscure the true liability position. How long will the full audit take? I asked. 60 days for a comprehensive report, she said. 30 days for a preliminary findings document sufficient to satisfy the covenant clause trigger. I need the preliminary findings in 30 days, I said. Understood, Dr. Crane said. Mr. Callahan, I want to ask you directly. Are you aware that filing the preliminary findings with the covenant notice will almost certainly trigger a parallel SEC inquiry? Once we document and certify these misstatements, we have our own disclosure obligations as a registered accounting firm. I'm aware, I said. That's not a complication, that's a confirmation. A beat of quiet. All right, she said. We'll begin Monday. Vincent called me on a Thursday evening 3 weeks into the audit. He sounded different than he had during the call from the parking garage. The compressed anger was still there. I could hear it like a current running beneath the surface of everything he said. But something else had joined it. A flatness. The particular exhaustion of a person who has been performing dignity in an environment designed to strip it away day after day without any visible end in sight. Richard gave a speech at the all-hands meeting today, he said, about the importance of every role in the company, about how the people who do the foundational work are the backbone of the operation. A short, humorless sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He looked directly at me when he said it. He was smiling. My jaw tightened so hard I felt it in my temples. He enjoys it, Vincent said quietly. That's what I didn't understand at first. I thought it was just business, politics, that he was testing me or managing me or doing something that had a rational explanation, but he enjoys it, Dad. He looked at me in that orange suit and he was happy. I know, I said. How do you know? I chose my words carefully. Because men like Richard Sterling need someone beneath them the way they need oxygen. It's not about you specifically. It's about what you represent, youth credentials, potential. Everything he's afraid of losing. Putting you in that basement wasn't a business decision. It was him telling himself a story about who matters. Vincent was quiet for a moment. That almost makes it worse. It should, I said. Hold on a little longer. Can you do that? How much longer? I did the calculation in my head. The preliminary audit findings were due in 9 days. Carol Finch had already prepared the covenant notice documentation. Once Dr. Crane's report was certified and delivered, the notice could be served within 24 hours. Not long, I said. I promise you, Vincent, not long. He exhaled slowly. Okay, Dad, I trust you. After we hung up, I walked to the window and stood looking out at the lake for a long time. The water was the color of pewter in the evening light, flat and enormous and indifferent the way large things are indifferent to the small dramas playing out on their edges. 9 days. In 9 days, Dr. Sylvia Crane would hand me a certified document that transformed a contractual right into a loaded weapon. And Richard Sterling, who was at this moment, somewhere in this city smiling at a memory of my son on his knees, would begin to learn what it felt like when the ground disappears beneath you without any warning at all. I pressed my palm flat against the cold glass of the window. 9 days, I told myself. Hold on. Dr. Sylvia Crane delivered the preliminary findings on a Friday morning 8 days early. She called at 7:52 a.m. before I had left the apartment while I was standing at the kitchen counter eating toast. I wasn't tasting and reading the same paragraph of the Tribune 3 times without absorbing a single word. Mr. Callahan, she said, the preliminary findings are complete and certified. I'm sending them to your legal team now. I want to walk you through the headline numbers before you read them. I set down the toast. Go ahead. Revenue inflation across the last 2 fiscal years, 31.4%, conservative estimate of concealed liabilities, $412 million. The Hammond and Joliet facilities are carried on the balance sheet at a combined valuation of $280 million. Current actual value accounting for OSHA remediation costs and deferred maintenance is approximately $31 million. She paused. Additionally, our analysis identified 3 intercompany transfers totaling $97 million moved from Sterling Biotech's operating accounts into subsidiary entities controlled exclusively by Richard Sterling personally. The transfers occurred over 14 months and have no documented business justification. My hand tightened around the phone. That last item, I said carefully, is that civil exposure or criminal? Both, Dr. Crane said. Our report documents it factually. What investigators do with it is their determination, not ours. But Mr. Callahan, I want to be direct. We filed our mandatory disclosure with the SEC this morning at 7 o'clock as required under our professional obligations. You should expect contact from their Division of Enforcement within the next 2 to 4 weeks. I expected it, I said. Thank you, Dr. Crane. Your team's work has been exceptional. One more thing, she said, and her voice shifted slightly. Still precise, but carrying something underneath it that sounded almost like human feeling. The 2,000 employees at Sterling Biotech. Whatever happens next, I hope someone is thinking about them. I looked out the kitchen window at the gray October sky. Someone is, I said. Carol Finch served the covenant notice at 2 p.m. that same Friday. Formal, certified, delivered by process server to Sterling Biotech's registered agent at their corporate headquarters in the West Loop, a glass tower on West Monroe Street that Richard Sterling had leased at a rate his company could not actually afford, because the appearance of success had always mattered more to him than its substance. The notice was 11 pages. It documented the covenant clause, cited the certified audit findings, and stated clearly that under the terms of the original debt agreement, now held by Callahan Capital Partners, Sterling Biotech was required to repay $3.5 billion in full within 30 days, or enter into immediate restructuring negotiations with the primary creditor. 30 days. I knew Richard Sterling would not have $3.5 billion in 30 days. I knew it with the same certainty I knew the water stain on my ceiling and the weight of Sandra's absence and the way Vincent held his shoulders when he was working hard at something difficult. What I did not know, what I had spent considerable time thinking about, was how Richard Sterling would react when he realized the notice had not come from a bank or a federal regulator or any of the institutional forces he had been managing and maneuvering around for years. It had come from Callahan Capital Partners, a name he did not recognize, a name that meant nothing to him yet. I was in my office when Patricia walked in at 4:37 p.m., holding a message slip with both hands, the way she held things when the content was significant. Richard Sterling's office called, she said. His personal attorney, a man named Frank Doyle, is requesting an urgent meeting with the principals of Callahan Capital Partners. He said Mr. Sterling wants to understand the nature of the creditor relationship and explore. She glanced at the slip cooperative resolution options. Cooperative resolution options? I almost smiled. Tell Mr. Doyle that the principals of Callahan Capital Partners are available Monday at 10 a.m., I said. Our office is on South Michigan Avenue. Mr. Sterling is welcome to attend personally if he chooses. Patricia wrote it down. Should I prepare a full briefing package for the meeting? No, I said. Just the covenant documentation and the audit report. Nothing else. She nodded and turned to leave. Patricia, I said. She stopped. After you make that call, take the rest of the afternoon off. You've earned it. She looked at me with the expression she reserved for moments when I said something that surprised her. A slight elevation of one eyebrow, a fractional softening around the eyes. Thank you, Arthur, she said. It was the first time in 11 years she had used my first name. Then she was gone. I turned back to the window. Lake Michigan was restless today, the surface broken into small whitecaps by a wind coming off the north. I watched it for a long time without thinking about anything in particular, just breathing, just feeling the day settle around me like sediment dropping to the bottom of still water. My phone buzzed. A text from Julian. Notice served. Sterling stock dropped 4% in after-hours trading. Word is getting out. How do you feel? I read it twice. Then I typed back, I feel like it's Monday yet. His reply came immediately. Ha! Get some rest. Big week. I pocketed the phone, picked up my jacket from the back of the chair, and walked out of the office into the corridor. The building was quiet at this hour. Most people already gone for the weekend. The hallways empty and echoing faintly under the fluorescent lights. I took the elevator down to the lobby, walked out onto South Michigan Avenue, and stood for a moment in the cold evening air. Somewhere across this city, Richard Sterling was reading an 11-page document and feeling for the first time the specific vertigo of a man who has built his entire life on the assumption that the ground is solid and has just discovered it isn't. I buttoned my jacket against the wind and walked to my car. Monday was 3 days away. Richard Sterling arrived at my office at 9:58 Monday morning. I knew it was him before Patricia announced him, because I heard his voice in the corridor, loud, precisely calibrated, the voice of a man who had spent decades using volume as a substitute for authority. He was talking to someone on his phone, finishing a sentence that ended with, "Tell them the situation is being managed." And the particular confidence in those words told me everything about how he had decided to approach this meeting. He believed he was coming to manage a situation. He had not yet understood that the situation was managing him. Patricia showed him into the conference room, where I was already seated, jacket on the audit report and covenant documentation stacked neatly in front of me, coffee on my right. His attorney, Frank Doyle, came in behind him. Doyle was the kind of lawyer who looked expensive. Silver cufflinks, a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent here, that had been cut within the last 48 hours. He carried a leather portfolio that he set on the table with the deliberate weight of a man placing a chess piece. Richard Sterling was 58 years old. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair swept back from a face that had once been handsome and was now merely commanding all jaw and brow, the kind of face that photographs well from a distance, but reveals its hardness up close. He wore a charcoal suit and a watch that I recognized as a Patek Philippe Nautilus, retail price approximately $120,000. A watch that cost more than my son's annual salary at a company that was $3.5 billion in debt. He looked at me and something moved across his face, a flicker of recalibration. He had expected someone different. Frank Doyle had run a background search on Callahan Capital Partners. Over the weekend I knew this because Patricia had flagged the inquiry on Friday afternoon. What Doyle found was a meticulously ordinary corporate profile, 2 decades of quiet, distressed asset acquisitions. No headlines, no litigation history, no red flags. Exactly what I had built it to look like. Older, perhaps, or more obviously institutional. Someone who looked like the kind of person who controlled $2.8 billion of his debt. I was 61 years old. I was wearing a gray suit I had owned for 7 years. My hands resting flat on the table bore the faint, permanent roughness of a man who had spent decades doing manual work alongside his other work. I did not look like what he expected. Good. "Mr. Callahan," he said, extending his hand across the table. His grip was firm and slightly too long, the handshake of a man who uses physical contact to establish hierarchy. "Richard Sterling, thank you for making time." "Of course," I said. "Please sit down." He sat. Doyle sat beside him, already opening his portfolio. "I'll be direct," Richard said, because men like Richard Sterling always announce their directness before deploying it selectively. "The covenant notice your firm served on Friday was unexpected. We were not aware that Meridian Capital had transferred their position. I'd like to understand the nature of Callahan Capital's interest in Sterling Biotech." "That's reasonable," I said. "Our interest is straightforward. We acquired Meridian's position because we believe Sterling Biotech's underlying assets have recoverable value that the current debt structure obscures. We intend to see that value realized." Doyle leaned forward. "Mr. Callahan, the covenant clause your notice relies upon requires a verified material misstatement in our client's financial disclosures. We intend to challenge the audit findings as—" "Mr. Doyle," I said, "the audit was conducted by Alderman and Cross, 40 years in operation, 3 federal agency relationships. The findings are certified and have already been submitted to the SEC's Division of Enforcement as of last Friday morning." I slid a copy of the filing confirmation across the table. "Challenging the findings is your right, but the SEC inquiry proceeds independently of our covenant action. You'd be fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously." Doyle looked at the document. His jaw tightened fractionally. Richard Sterling had not moved. He was watching me with the careful attention of a man who has just realized he may have made an error in his initial assessment and is working to determine the scope of that error. "What do you want?" he said. The directness this time was real. "A negotiated resolution," I said. "The 30-day repayment window is not a deadline I set arbitrarily. It's a contractual right. But I have no interest in forcing a disorderly bankruptcy that destroys the company's remaining value and puts 2,000 people out of work." I let that land. "What I want is a structured transfer of ownership. Callahan Capital Partners assumes Sterling Biotech's debt obligations entirely. In exchange, we receive controlling equity, a minimum of 70% of outstanding shares." The room was very quiet. Richard Sterling's face had changed. The commanding architecture of it was still there, the jaw, the brow, the silver hair, but something underneath had shifted. The color had drained slightly from beneath his tan, the way color drains from a face when the body receives information that the mind hasn't finished processing yet. "You want my company," he said. "I want to save your company," I said. "From you." I said it quietly, without heat, without satisfaction, without any of the emotion that had been living in my chest since the night I saw that photograph. I said it the way you state a fact that does not require emphasis because its truth is sufficient. Frank Doyle started to speak. Richard Sterling raised one hand and stopped him. For a long moment, Richard looked at me. Across the table, really looked the way a man looks when he is trying to find something in another person's face and is discovering that there is nothing there for him to use. "I need time," he said finally. "You have 29 days, I said. "We'll talk again on Friday." I stood. The meeting was over. Richard Sterling stood too slowly, like a man whose legs had become uncertain beneath him. He buttoned his jacket with hands that were not quite steady. I noticed that. I said nothing about it, but I noticed. Vincent called me that same Monday evening. He didn't know about the meeting. He didn't know about the covenant, notice, the audit, Meridian Capital, or any of the machinery I had been assembling quietly in the background of his life for the past 2 months. He called because Elena had come home from work with red eyes and a bruise on her wrist that she said was from a door handle, and Vincent did not believe her. "She won't tell me what happened," he said. His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the fear underneath it, raw and close to the surface. The fear of a man watching someone he loves absorb damage she refuses to name. "Dad, I've seen that look before. That's not a door handle." "Where is she now?" I asked. "In the bathroom. She said she needed a few minutes." A sharp exhale. "I don't know what to do. Every time I ask, she deflects. She says she's fine. She says it was an accident. She says I'm overreacting. But her hands were shaking when she came in. Her whole body was shaking, and she was trying to hide it." My chest tightened. Has this happened before, the deflecting?" "Once. About 3 weeks ago, she came home quiet, really quiet. The kind of quiet that fills up a room, and when I asked, she said she'd had a hard day at work. I let it go." His voice cracked slightly on the last 3 words. "I shouldn't have let it go." "Vincent," I said carefully, "does Elena have her own income, her own accounts?" "Yes, she has a position at a design firm downtown. She's been there 2 years. Why?" "Just understanding the full picture," I said. "When she comes out of the bathroom, don't interrogate her. Don't push. Just be present. Make her tea. Sit close. Let her feel safe enough to talk when she's ready." "I'm not built for waiting, Dad." "I know," I said. "Do it anyway. And Vincent, if that bruise looks worse tomorrow, I want you to take photographs. Document it. Don't alarm her about why. Just document it." A pause. "You think Richard did this?" I didn't answer immediately. I stood at my kitchen window looking out at the dark street below, at the orange circles of the streetlights and the empty sidewalk, and the ordinary quiet of a Monday night in Pilsen that had nothing to do with the extraordinary violence of a powerful man reminding a young woman of her place. I said that Richard Sterling is a man who uses the people around him the way he uses everything else as instruments. And when instruments don't perform the way he wants, he doesn't repair them. He damages them. Vincent was breathing hard on the other end. "If he touched her, then it will be handled," I said. "Legally, completely. I promise you that." I paused. "But right now, the only thing that matters is Elena feeling safe tonight. Can you do that?" Another pause longer this time. Yeah? He said. Yeah, I can do that. Good. Call me tomorrow. After we hung up, I called a woman named Diana Osei, a family law and civil litigation attorney I had worked with twice before on matters involving workplace coercion. I had her personal number because, in my experience, the matters that required Diana, Osei never arrived during business hours. She answered on the second ring. Arthur, she said, it's 9:30 at night. I know, I said. I'm sorry. I need 30 minutes. A brief pause, then the sound of a chair adjusting. Go ahead. I told her everything I knew. Elena's bruise, the shaking hands, the prior incident 3 weeks ago, the relationship between Elena and Richard Sterling, the power differential involved. Diana Osei listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I valued most about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. If the bruise is documented and Elena is willing to make a statement, she said, we're looking at potential civil battery. Depending on prior incidents and any witnesses, potentially a pattern of intimidation or coercion. Illinois law provides strong protections here. She paused. But Arthur, the key word is willing. Elena has to want to pursue this. Victims of coercive behavior from powerful figures often don't, at least not initially. The fear of retaliation is real, and it's rational. I understand that, I said. I'm not trying to force her hand. I want her to know that if she decides to pursue it, she has resources. She has counsel. She has someone who will stand behind her regardless of what Richard Sterling does in response. Does she know you? Margaret asked. She knows Vincent, I said. Through Vincent, she knows me. Then make sure she knows not through Vincent directly that you are there. Women in that position need to hear it from the person offering the support, not secondhand. A beat. I'll draft a preliminary options memo tomorrow. No obligation, no pressure, just so she has information. Thank you, Diana, I said. Don't thank me yet, she said. Get Elena to a doctor tomorrow if she'll go. Physical documentation from a medical professional is significantly stronger than photographs alone. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. My hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold, staring at nothing in particular. I was angry. Not the cold, strategic anger I carried into conference rooms and negotiating tables. This was something older and rawer, the anger of a parent, or perhaps simply of a person who has lived long enough to recognize the specific ugliness of a powerful man using his power against someone smaller. Richard Sterling had spent months humiliating my son. Now I understood he had been doing the same thing to Elena. 29 days, I thought. He had 29 days left to feel like the most powerful man in any room. I intended to make the most of every single one of them. Elena came to see me on a Wednesday afternoon, 4 days after Vincent's call. She came alone. She had texted Vincent's number first, a single line, "Can I talk to your dad? Just him." Vincent had forwarded it to me without comment, which told me he understood that some conversations require a particular kind of space that even the people who love you most cannot provide. He had enough sense and enough love to know the difference, and the knowing of it made me proud of him in a way that had nothing to do with accomplishment. She arrived at the apartment in Pilsen at 2 o'clock. I had made coffee and set out the good cups, the ones Sandra had picked out at a market in Wicker Park the year before she got sick, white ceramic with a thin blue line around the rim. I had kept those cups through every year since, through every move I hadn't made and every renovation I hadn't done, because some objects hold people in them long after the people are gone, and you learn to be careful with the things that hold. Small things matter when someone is trying to feel safe. Elena Reyes Sterling was 26 years old. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. At least that was what Vincent had told me once, laughing, saying she was the most beautiful argument he had ever seen. Standing in my doorway that afternoon, she looked smaller than I expected. Not physically, she was tall, composed, impeccably dressed. Even now, in a camel coat and dark trousers, her hair pulled back with the kind of precision that takes effort to appear effortless. But there was something compressed about her, the way a person looks when they have been making themselves smaller for a long time and have almost forgotten their original dimensions. The way a person looks when they have been managing someone else's volatility for so long that stillness has become their default posture, not their natural one. Her left wrist had a fading yellow-green bruise that she had not entirely concealed beneath her sleeve. "Thank you for coming," I said. Please come in. She sat at the kitchen table, Sandra's table, the one I had never replaced. The one with the worn patch near the left edge, where Vincent used to rest his forearm during homework, and wrapped both hands around the coffee cup I set in front of her. Her knuckles were white against the ceramic. She stared at the surface of the coffee for a long moment before she looked up at me as though she was gathering something from the stillness of the liquid. Vincent doesn't know I'm here, she said. I know, I said. That's fine. I need you to understand. She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again with the careful deliberateness of someone who has rehearsed what they want to say, and is now discovering that the rehearsed version is insufficient for the actual weight of the room. I need you to understand that I love my father. Whatever he is, whatever he's done, he's still my father, and I'm not here to destroy him. I understand that, I said, and I did. I had lived long enough to know that love and damage are not mutually exclusive, that you can love someone with everything you have and still be harmed by them, and that the love does not make the harm less real, only more complicated. Her eyes filled. She blinked rapidly 3 times, refusing to let the tears fall, the gesture of a woman who had trained herself not to cry in front of people because crying had been used against her before turned into evidence of weakness by someone who needed her to be weak in order to feel strong. My chest ached watching it. I recognized the training. I had seen it before in people who had spent years in the presence of someone who treated their emotions as liabilities. He grabbed my wrist, she said, 2 weeks ago and again last Friday, because I told him I didn't think Vincent deserved to be in the containment unit. I told him Vincent was talented, and the assignment was... She exhaled sharply a breath that carried everything she was choosing not to say. He told me that I didn't understand how business worked, and when I pushed back, he grabbed my wrist and told me that my job was to be his daughter, not his conscience. The anger that moved through me was very quiet and very complete, not the hot reactive anger of a man who has been surprised by something I had not been surprised. I had suspected this the moment Vincent described Elena's shaking hands. This was the colder, more deliberate anger of a man who has confirmed what he already knew, and who understands that confirmation is not an ending, but a beginning. Has he done this before? I asked. Physically. Not before Vincent started at the company, she said. Before that, it was just words. The way he talks to people. Cutting. Precise. He knows exactly where to press. He has known since I was a child exactly which words would reach me most directly, and he has never hesitated to use that knowledge when he felt the situation required it. She looked down at her coffee again. When Vincent came into the picture, something changed in him. I don't fully understand it. It's like Vincent existing in his building was a personal offense. He couldn't... She shook her head slowly. He couldn't tolerate someone young and capable being near him without needing to diminish them. And when I refused to participate in the diminishment, he turned it toward me. I sat with that for a moment. There was nothing to say that would make it smaller or simpler, and I had no interest in making it either. She had come here to be heard, not managed. Elena, I said gently, would you be willing to speak with an attorney not to commit to anything? Not to set anything in motion that you haven't chosen to set in motion? Just to understand what your options are so that whatever you decide it with full information. She looked at me with an expression that was equal parts relief and terror, the expression of a person who has been waiting for someone to ask that question and is now afraid of what saying yes might cost them, afraid of the weight of the door opening, afraid most of all that she might walk through it and find herself more alone on the other side than she was before. What would happen to him? She asked. That depends entirely on what you decide, I said. Nothing happens without your consent. Nothing moves without your direction. You are in control of every step, every single one. I will not move anything, speak to anyone, or take any action related to your situation without your explicit approval. That is a promise, and I do not make promises I don't intend to keep. Her chin trembled. She pressed her hand flat against the table, Sandra's table, and took a slow breath that I could see her building deliberately, the way you build something when the alternative is collapse. My mother left him when I was 16, she said quietly. She said she stayed 10 years longer than she should have because she thought love was supposed to feel like surviving something, like endurance, was the proof of sincerity. A tear escaped, then tracking silently down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away this time. She let it fall, and there was something significant in the letting, something that looked like the very beginning of a decision. I swore I would never stay anywhere that long. I swore I would always know when to leave. You know now, I said. She looked at me directly, and in her eyes I saw something shift. Something that had been held at a particular angle for a long time, slowly, carefully, deliberately releasing. Not breaking, releasing. The difference matters. Yes, she said. I think I do. We talked for another hour. By the time she left, she had Diana Osei's number in her phone, a copy of the preliminary options memo printed and folded in her coat pocket, and an appointment at Northwestern Memorial Hospital the following morning to have her wrist formally examined and documented by a physician whose findings would carry the weight of the medical record rather than the uncertainty of a photograph. She hugged me at the door, briefly tightly, the hug of someone who doesn't do it lightly and means it completely when they do. Thank you, Mr. Callahan, she said against my shoulder. Arthur, I said, please. She pulled back and looked at me, and for just a moment, she smiled small and real and exhausted, the smile of a person setting down something they have carried too long and feeling for the first time in a while the strange lightness of hands that are finally empty. Thank you, Arthur, she said. I watched her walk down the corridor to the elevator. I watched the elevator doors close. Then I turned back into the apartment and stood in the kitchen for a long time, my hand resting on the table, feeling the worn smoothness of the wood beneath my palm. The smoothness that came from years of hands resting in exactly this way, from Sandra's hands and my hands, and Vincent's small hands, all of us at one time or another, pressing our weight into this surface and finding it solid. 26 days remained. Richard Sterling was running out of time in every direction simultaneously, and he didn't know it yet. Richard Sterling threw a gala on the 22nd day of his 30-day window. I learned about it from Julian, who had a contact at the event. Planning firm Sterling had hired, the kind of contact that existed, because Julian had spent 30 years building a network of people who owed him small favors, and understood that small favors properly maintained occasionally became significant ones. He's calling it a stakeholder appreciation event, Julian told me over the phone. Navy Pier, Grand Ballroom, 400 guest investors, creditors, media, city officials, open bar, live orchestra, the works. A pause. Arthur, the man is 8 days away from a covenant deadline, and he's throwing a party for 400 people. How much is it costing? I asked. The deposit alone was $280,000, Julian said, paid from Sterling Biotech's operating account. I closed my eyes for a moment. $280,000 from an operating account that was partially funded by the deferred wages of 2,000 employees. Who's on the guest list? I asked. Everyone who matters in Chicago finance and city government, plus 3 representatives from the SEC's Chicago regional office. Apparently Richard invited them personally, which is either spectacularly arrogant or spectacularly stupid. Both, I said. Julian, get me 2 tickets. A beat of silence. You're going. We're going, I said. You and I. And bring the full presentation package, the one you've been building for the board transition. Arthur? Richard Sterling is about to stand in front of 400 of his most important relationships and tell them everything is fine. I said, I want to be in the room when he does it. Navy Pier on a November evening was cold and magnificent. The lake black and enormous beyond the windows of the Grand Ballroom. The Chicago skyline blazing against the dark sky like a second constellation. The room was everything Richard Sterling's public image required. Crystal chandeliers, white-clothed tables, an orchestra, playing something classical and expensive in the corner, waitstaff moving through the crowd with the practiced invisibility of people paid to be unnoticed. 400 people, every one of them dressed in the language of money. Julian and I arrived at 7:15. We were not on the official guest list. Julian's contact had arranged 2 legitimate transferable tickets from a creditor firm that had quietly declined their invitation. We were real guests. We had every right to be there. I wore the 7-year-old gray suit. Julian looked at it when I picked him up and said, You could have worn something newer. I know, I said. I found Richard Sterling near the center of the room 40 minutes after we arrived. He was holding court. That was the only phrase for it, surrounded by 6 or 7 people who were laughing at something he had just said. Their laughter slightly too loud, slightly too sustained. The laughter of people in proximity to power who have learned that enthusiasm is a form of currency. He looked magnificent, relaxed, untouchable. The Patek Philippe on his wrist caught the chandelier light as he gestured, and I thought about 2,000 employees whose deferred wages had helped pay for the room we were all standing in. He saw me at 8:40. I was standing near the east windows with Julian watching the lake when I felt the shift in the room's social geometry, a subtle change in the direction of attention, the way a crowd unconsciously orients when something unexpected enters its field. I turned and found Richard Sterling walking toward me with the smooth, unhurried stride of a man who has decided to control the encounter before it controls him. "Mr. Callahan," he said, extending his hand. His grip was firm. His eyes were reading me with intense, rapid attention. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I was invited," I said. "Congratulations on a beautiful event." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I appreciate you making time, though I'd have preferred to discuss our situation in a more appropriate setting." "Of course," I said pleasantly. "How are the negotiations progressing with your other creditors?" "I understand First Midwest called their line last week." Something moved across his face, quick, involuntary, a flash of something hot and unguarded, before the controlled mask reassembled itself. He had not expected me to know about First Midwest, which meant he had not yet understood the scope of what he was dealing with. "That's being managed," he said. "I'm sure it is," I said. I glanced around the room, the chandeliers, the orchestra, the 400 carefully cultivated relationships. "Richard, can I give you a piece of advice, genuinely?" He studied me. "Go ahead. Stop performing," I said quietly. "The people in this room, your investors, your creditors, the 3 gentlemen from the SEC near the bar, they're not seeing what you want them to see tonight. They're seeing a man spending money. He doesn't have to convince them. He has money he doesn't have. And the longer the performance continues, the worse the ending becomes." His face had gone very still. The color beneath his tan had shifted again, the same drainage I had seen across the conference table 11 days ago accelerating now. "You have 7 days left on your window," I said. "Call my office tomorrow morning. Let's end this cleanly." He said nothing. For the first time since I had met Richard Sterling, he had nothing to deploy. No volume, no authority, no performance. Just a man standing in the middle of a party he had thrown for himself, surrounded by 400 witnesses, looking at the person who held the instrument of his ruin, and finding nothing in that person's face that he could use or negotiate with, or charm. I nodded once, turned, and walked back toward the windows. Julian was waiting with 2 fresh glasses of water. "Well," he said quietly. "Tomorrow morning," I said. "He'll call." Richard Sterling called at 7:53 the following morning. Not Frank Doyle, not an assistant. Richard himself, which told me that the night had not been kind to him, that he had lain awake in whatever room he occupied, at the top of whatever building he owned, staring at a ceiling that no longer felt like a ceiling he could trust, and had reached the particular threshold where pride becomes more expensive than surrender. "I want to meet today," he said. His voice was different. The calibrated volume was gone. What remained was flatter, stripped of performance, the voice of a man speaking from a place he had never intended to reach. "Just the 2 of us. No attorneys." "No attorneys means nothing. We discussed today is binding," I said. "I know that," he said. I need to understand who you are before I sign anything." I considered this. It was the most honest thing Richard Sterling had said to me since we had met across that conference table. 1 o'clock, I said. "My office." He arrived alone as agreed. No Frank Doyle, no leather portfolio, no Patek Philippe, or rather the watch was still on his wrist, but it looked different today. Yesterday it had been an instrument of display. Today it was just a watch on the arm of a tired man in a good suit who had not slept. Patricia showed him in without ceremony. He sat across from me, and for a moment he simply looked around the office at the desk, the windows, the lake beyond the framed photograph on the credenza that I had placed there deliberately this morning. The photograph of Vincent at his Georgetown graduation navy gown, mortarboard slightly crooked, grinning with his whole face. Richard's eyes landed on it, and stayed there for 3 seconds. Then he looked at me. "That's your son," he said. "That's my son." I confirmed. Something shifted in his expression. Not remorse exactly, not yet, but the beginning of a recalculation that was larger and more personal than anything involving debt structures or covenant clauses. He was beginning to understand that this had never been a random distressed debt acquisition. He was beginning to understand the architecture of what had been assembled around him and by whom and why. "How long?" he asked quietly. "Since the night I received a photograph of him in an orange suit in your basement?" I said. "Approximately 90 days. He exhaled through his nose a long, slow breath that carried something in it I recognized as the precise sound of a man releasing an illusion he had been maintaining at considerable cost. "What are your terms?" he said. I slid the document across the desk. 6 pages prepared by Carol Finch's team and reviewed by my own counsel. Clean, comprehensive, every term clearly stated. Callahan Capital Partners assumed Sterling Biotech's full debt obligations, $3.5 billion, I said. In exchange, we received 72% of outstanding equity, effective immediately upon signing. You retain 28% as a minority, non-voting shareholder. You resign as CEO and from the board within 7 days of signing. You receive a severance package of $2 million paid over 24 months, contingent on your full cooperation with the transition and compliance with all SEC inquiries. Richard picked up the document. He read slowly. I watched his face move through the pages. The controlled tension, the occasional tightening around his eyes when he reached a term that cost him something the moment. On page 4, when he reached the clause about his resignation, and his hand tightened on the paper, the way a hand tightens on something it is about to let go of. 28% non-voting, he said. Correct. You're leaving me with a stake I have no power over. I'm leaving you with a residual value in a company that will be solvent again within 18 months under proper management, I said, which is considerably more than a federal bankruptcy proceeding would leave you with. He set the document down. He pressed both hands flat on the desk and stared at them, his hands broad and manicured, the hands of a man who had never cleaned anything in his life, and I watched something move through him that I had not expected to see and did not particularly enjoy seeing. His eyes were wet, not weeping. Richard Sterling was not a man who wept, or at least not yet, not here, but his eyes were bright with the particular moisture of a person who is holding back something large and has not entirely succeeded. My father built that company, he said. His voice was rough at the edges. 30 years. He built it from nothing. A single plant in Gary, Indiana. He used to take me there on Saturdays when I was a boy and show me the production lines and tell me. He stopped, swallowed. He told me it would outlast both of us if I took care of it. The anger I carried did not disappear in that moment, but it made room the way a crowded room makes room when something unexpected enters, for something more complicated, for the understanding that the men who damage things are not always men who never loved anything. Sometimes they are men who loved something and failed it, and the failure became a wound they spent years covering with performance and control, and the diminishment of anyone who reminded them of what they had lost. I did not say any of this. Sign the document, Richard, I said quietly. Let someone take care of it now. He picked up the pen. His hand was shaking, not slightly, not fractionally, but visibly, undeniably, the shake of a man at the absolute limit of what he can hold together. He signed 6 pages, each one deliberate, each one costing him something I could see in his face and would not describe to anyone, because some moments of human diminishment, even deserved ones, belong only to the room they occur in. When he finished, he set the pen down and straightened in his chair. What happens to the employees? He asked. They keep their jobs, I said. Every one of them. Salaries current within 60 days. Benefits restored. The Hammond and Joliet facilities reopened within 6 months, pending OSHA clearance. He nodded slowly, just once. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket with hands that had steadied slightly, and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. Your son, he said without turning around. He's good. Whatever you think of me, he's genuinely good at what he does. I looked at the photograph on the credenza. Vincent grinning at his Georgetown graduation. Mortarboard slightly crooked. I know, I said. Richard Sterling walked out. I sat at my desk for a long time after the door closed, my hands flat on the surface, the signed document between them, the lake enormous and silver beyond the window. I had done it. It was done. I called Vincent at 6:14 the following morning. He answered on the first ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. There was a particular quality to his voice at that hour, unguarded, stripped of the careful composure he had been maintaining for 90 days, in that building like a house with all its curtains open. "Dad," he said, "is everything okay?" "Everything is fine," I said. "I need you to do something for me this morning." "Okay?" Alert now, fully present. "What?" "Don't go to the containment unit," I said. "When you arrive at Sterling Biotech today, go directly to the executive floor, conference room B. Be there at 9 a.m. A long pause. "Dad, what did you do?" I smiled, the real one, quiet and private, the same one I had allowed myself the night Julian texted, "We're actually doing this." "I'll explain everything at 9. Just be there." "You're scaring me a little." "Good," I said. "You should be a little scared. It means you understand that something significant is happening." He laughed short, surprised, the laugh of a person who didn't expect to laugh in that moment and couldn't help it anyway. "Okay, conference room B, 9 a.m. Wear the good suit," I said. Another pause. "The Georgetown interview suit, unless you have something better." "Dad, 9 a.m. Vincent." I arrived at Sterling Biotech's West Loop headquarters at 8:30. The building lobby was all glass and polished concrete, with the Sterling Biotech logo etched into the wall behind the reception desk in brushed steel letters 2 feet high. I had walked past this building a dozen times in the past 3 months without entering it. Now I walked through the front doors as the primary controlling creditor of every square foot of it, and the difference between those two versions of the same walk was not something I could easily articulate. Patricia had sent the formal notification to Sterling Biotech's board of directors and executive team at 7 a.m. a single document, clean and direct, informing them that effective the previous afternoon, Callahan Capital Partners had executed a controlling equity transfer agreement with Richard Sterling and was now the majority shareholder of Sterling Biotech with all associated governance rights. Richard Sterling had resigned as CEO and from the board effective immediately. A transition management team would be in place within 72 hours. The lobby receptionist, a young woman named Keisha, according to her badge, looked at me with wide eyes as I approached the desk. "Good morning," I said. "Arthur Callahan. I believe I'm expected." She checked her screen, checked it again, and then looked up with the expression of someone whose morning has taken a turn they were not trained for. "Yes, Mr. Callahan? Of course. Let me call upstairs." "Thank you, Keisha," I said. "Take your time." Conference room B was on the 14th floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. Julian was already there when I arrived, his laptop open, 3 printed copies of the transition document stacked precisely at the head of the table. He looked up when I walked in and gave me a nod that contained in its economy everything that 22 years of working together had built between us. "The board is assembling in the main conference room," he said. 6 members. 2 are asking for an emergency injunction to block the transfer. "They won't get it," I said. "The agreement is clean and the covenant clause is airtight. Carol Finch will handle any legal challenges before noon." "Diana Osei called," Julian added. "Elena's medical documentation was formally filed this morning. Richard Sterling's personal attorney received notice at 7:30. I nodded. "How is Elena?" "Vincent's with her," Julian said. "She's steadier, apparently." Vincent said she finally slept. Something in my chest released that I hadn't realized had been held. Vincent arrived at 8:58, 2 minutes early, which was exactly like him. He came through the conference room door in the Georgetown interview suit, navy slightly too formal for a Tuesday morning perfect, and stopped when he saw me standing at the window. He looked around the room, at Julian, at the transition documents, at the Chicago River 14 floors below, then back at me. "Dad," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Tell me what happened." So I told him. All of it. Meridian Capital, the covenant clause, the forensic audit, the $1.8 billion, the meeting with Richard, the gala, the signed agreement on my desk. I told him about Callahan Capital Partners, the real version, the full version, the version I had kept carefully out of his sight for 22 years. because I needed him to build himself without the shadow of my resources, distorting his sense of his own capability. I told him while the Chicago River moved below us and the morning light came through the windows, and Julian sat quietly at the end of the table, eyes on his laptop, giving us the privacy of his inattention. When I finished, Vincent was standing very still. His jaw was working, his eyes were bright. Not the brittle brightness of unshed tears, but something deeper, something that comes from a level of feeling that the body doesn't quite know how to process. His hands hanging at his sides were trembling very slightly. "You've had this whole time," he started. "Yes," I said. "And you never told me." "No, because you wanted me to know I could do it myself," he said. Not a question. A man arriving at an understanding that rearranges something fundamental in him. "Because you needed to know," I said, "and now you do." He crossed the room in 4 steps and put his arms around me the way he had as a boy, completely without reservation, without any of the careful adult management of physical affection that grows up between fathers and sons over time. His shoulders shook once, twice. Against the shoulder of the 7-year-old gray suit, he wept. Not the compressed, controlled leak of a man trying to hold himself together, but openly, fully, the way you weep when something that has been held too tight for too long is finally allowed to release. I held him the way I had held him when he was 7, and Sandra had just died, and the world had become suddenly and irrevocably smaller. My eyes burned. I did not try to stop it. "It's done," I said into his shoulder. "It's done, buddy. You're home." There was one thing I never told him, that the photograph came from Elena. She had sent it from a burner number she bought at a convenience store 2 days after her father first grabbed her wrist. She didn't know who else to warn. She only knew that Vincent had mentioned once that his father was the kind of man who paid attention. She was right. 5 years is a long time. Long enough for a company to go from $3.5 billion in debt to its first profitable quarter. Long enough for 2 sealed plants in Hammond and Joliet to reopen past OSHA inspection and run at full capacity. Long enough for 2,000 employees to go from receiving deferred wages and borrowed benefits to receiving Christmas bonuses for the 3rd consecutive year. Long enough for a son to become the kind of man his mother always knew he would be. I retired 18 months after the acquisition closed. Not because I was tired. I have never been a man who tires easily, but because the work was done and the right hands were holding it, and there is a particular kind of wisdom in knowing when to step back from something you built so that it can become fully itself without you standing in the center of it. Vincent had been CEO of what was now called Callahan Biotech for 4 years and 3 months. The rebranding had been his idea. He had come to me 6 months after the transition with a single sheet of paper, a proposal, formal and thorough, the way he approached every significant thing, and slid it across the kitchen table in the Pilsen apartment. "I want to rename the company," he said. "Tell me why," I said. "Because Sterling was a performance," he said. "A name that was supposed to communicate value that wasn't actually there. I want a name that means something real, something we actually earned." He paused. "And because I want people to know whose family built it." My throat tightened. I looked at the proposal for a long moment without speaking. "Callahan Biotech," I said finally. "Callahan Biotech," he confirmed. I signed the proposal with the same pen I had used to sign every significant document of my professional life, a plain black ballpoint, the kind that costs $1.50 at any drugstore in the country, and slid it back across the table. The Maxwell Street Market still runs on Sundays. I still go. Not to sell. I closed the folding table 3 years ago, the morning after Julian threw me a retirement dinner at a restaurant in River North that I had specifically told him not to do, and that I was genuinely glad he ignored me about. I go because the market is the truest place I know, because it smells like cold metal and street food, and the specific honesty of people who are not performing anything, and because Don is still there with his chessboard, and Rosa still brings sweet bread on the last Sunday of every month, and some things should not change even when everything else does. Don was the first person I told, actually, not about the acquisition. He doesn't follow business news and wouldn't have known what a covenant clause was if I'd explained it for an hour. I told him about Vincent, about the orange suit, about what I had done and why. He listened the way Don always listens, completely unhurriedly, with the particular quality of attention that people who have seen a great deal of life bring to the stories of other people who have also seen a great deal of life. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he moved his bishop 2 squares and looked up at me. "You should have told the boy sooner," he said. "I laughed, a real one, sudden and genuine, the kind that catches you before you can decide whether or not to allow it." "Maybe," I said. "Not maybe," Don said. "Definitely." He moved his rook. "But you did right by him. Sandra would be proud of you." My eyes burned. I looked at the chessboard and did not try to stop it. "Thank you, Don," I said. He waved one hand dismissively, the gesture of a man who finds gratitude unnecessary between people who understand each other. "Your move." Elena and Vincent were married in September, 2 years after the acquisition. The ceremony was small, 30 people in a garden in Evanston afternoon light, coming through oak trees that were just beginning to turn, the kind of day that feels like the world is making a deliberate effort to be beautiful. Elena wore a dress the color of cream and carried a single stem of something small and white that I didn't know the name of, but that Sandra would have known immediately and been able to tell me the history of. I walked her down the aisle because her own father was not there. Richard Sterling had not been invited. That was Elena's decision, made quietly and without drama, communicated to him through Diana Osai's office 8 weeks before the wedding. He had not contested it. From what Julian's contacts indicated, Richard had spent the past 3 years significantly reduced. The West Loop Tower, replaced by a condominium in Wicker Park. The Patek Philippe, replaced by something considerably more modest. The commanding social presence, replaced by a quieter life that he appeared from a distance to be learning to inhabit. I did not feel triumphant about this. I had felt what I needed to feel. The morning after the document was signed, standing at the window, watching the silver lake, and I had let it move through me, and then I had set it down. Triumph requires an ongoing enemy, and I had no interest in making a project of Richard Sterling's diminishment. What mattered was what had been built, not what had been taken. I walked Elena down that garden aisle with her arm tucked into mine and her head just slightly inclined toward my shoulder. And when we reached the end and I placed her hand in Vincent's, he looked at me over her head with an expression that I will carry for the rest of my life. Gratitude and love, and the particular completion of a man who has arrived somewhere he always hoped to arrive, and is finally fully present in it. I pressed his hand once, then I took my seat in the front row and wept through the entire ceremony, which Rosa, sitting next to me, handled by producing a travel packet of tissues from her purse, with the calm efficiency of a woman who had anticipated this outcome and prepared accordingly. "You're a mess," she whispered. "I know," I whispered back. She patted my hand. "Sandra would be a bigger mess," she said. I laughed and wept simultaneously, which is apparently something the human body is capable of when the feeling is large enough. Their daughter was born 14 months later. February, a Tuesday. Vincent called me from the hospital at 3:47 in the morning, his voice entirely unraveled, shaking and laughing and catching on itself, the voice of a man whose entire understanding of love has just been permanently and irreversibly expanded. "Dad," he said. "Dad, she's here. She's Dad. I don't have words." "You don't need words," I said. My own voice was not steady. "What's her name?" A pause full of something enormous. "Sandra," he said. "We're naming her Sandra." I pressed the phone against my chest and sat on the edge of my bed. In the Pilsen apartment, the same water stain on the ceiling, the same 3 rooms that had held 22 years of a life I had built around a boy. I was determined not to fail, and I wept in a way I had not wept since the night Sandra died. Not from grief, from the fullness of it, from the understanding that love properly tended does not diminish when the person it was given for is gone. It finds its way forward. It moves through the people who carry it into the next generation and the one after that, patient and persistent and entirely indifferent to the obstacles placed in its path. Sandra Callahan was 7 pounds 4 ounces born at 3:31 a.m. on a Tuesday in February, and she had her grandmother's name and, according to Vincent, her grandmother's eyes. I was at the hospital by 5 a.m. I am sitting at my folding table on Maxwell Street as I write this. Not the original table that one finally gave up one of its legs last spring, and I replaced it with an identical one from the same hardware store on Blue Island Avenue, because some things should be repaired in kind. The October air is cold and clean, the kind of cold that makes the city feel precise and true, all its edges sharpened. Don is to my left studying a chess problem he has been working on for 3 weeks. Rosa brought sweet bread this morning, the good kind from the bakery on 18th Street, and the smell of it is mixing with cold metal and car exhaust, and the particular scent of a Sunday market that has been running in one form or another since 1871. On the table in front of me, 3 broken watches, 2 old radios, a cracked compass, and a photograph. Vincent and Elena at the hospital, Sandra between them, her grandmother's name and her grandmother's eyes, the 3 of them lit by the particular soft light of a room where something new has just arrived in the world. I look at it the way I have always looked, at the things that matter most to me with full attention, without hurry, understanding that the capacity to be present for a moment is itself a form of wealth that no covenant clause can transfer and no debt structure can touch. Don moves his bishop and looks up at me. "Your move, Arthur," he says. I set the photograph down carefully, pick up a broken watch, and get back to work. People sometimes ask me if I regret any of it. I don't. But I'll tell you what I do regret. The years I spent believing that staying silent was the same as staying strong, that swallowing your pain and working in the dark and never letting anyone see what you were carrying was a virtue. It isn't. It's just a slower way of being alone. This is a father revenge story, yes, but not the kind Hollywood sells you. This is one of those family stories revenge tells quietly over decades, through patience and sacrifice, and the willingness to play a long game when everyone else has already left the table. If you've ever watched someone you love be humiliated by a powerful person and felt completely helpless, then you already understand why a father revenge like this one doesn't start with anger. It starts with love. Looking back honestly at my own story, at every family story's revenge journey I've witnessed and lived, the lesson is always the same. Don't wait. Don't carry the weight alone the way I did. Don't let pride keep you silent when the people who love you need the truth. That's my one real regret, and I'm giving it to you freely so you don't have to earn it the hard way. My personal belief, and I mean this completely, is that God doesn't waste suffering. Every season of humiliation, every basement, every orange suit, every moment of white devastation has a purpose that your limited view from inside it cannot yet see. Trust the process, even when the process is painful. Because father revenge done right isn't about destroying someone. And the best family stories revenge ever told aren't about hatred at all. They're about restoration, about dignity reclaimed, about love that refused to quit. If this story reached something real inside you, drop a comment below and tell me which moment hit hardest. Share it with someone who needs to hear that patience wins. And if this channel has earned a place in your day, subscribing takes 2 seconds and means everything to us. Thank you truly and sincerely for staying with me all the way to the very last word.